Hello, environmental science students. This is Dr. Harrer. This lesson is going to cover the topic of climate change. And when we talk about climate change, we have to consider how biogeochemistry of our planet plays a role and is influenced and impacted by humans, markedly by human population growth. When we are discussing global climate change that has been observed and recorded over the history of several thousand years of data now, we have to make sure that the information that we're communicating, interpreting, and integrating into future conservation and management plans have all considered science that has been reviewed by other experts in the field. We call this peer review, and so we want to make sure that the information that we are explaining and interpreting is coming from sources that have been reviewed by the scientific community. In this lecture, we'll look at the evidence that global climate is changing due to human-induced causes. We will look at the relationship between the human population size, fossil fuel emissions, and global average temperatures, reviewing data that has been collected from long-term sources and analyzed and reviewed by experts in the field, largely from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, as well as NASA. In this lecture, you will begin by reviewing the biogeochemical cycles of Earth, how they're altered by human activity, and data that has been collected, peer-reviewed, and describes the history of the planet over many thousands of years.
This term here, biogeochemical, as you can see by its components, we're talking about really how chemicals are cycling through ecosystems. We know ecosystems consist of a living and a non-living component. These components are interacting. And so obviously the bio part of this word describes the living component. And now remember, atoms are the smallest unit of matter. They're not alive. So this is really a chemistry level. These chemicals are all made available through the crust and the soils of the planet. And these chemicals that are acquired from the crust and the soils of the planet are taken up by living organisms, and they're transformed. They're converted to different forms as organisms use them to build their structures and to drive their metabolism. And so as we study these cycles, this is going to determine where we can find things. So when we talk about productivity, talking about a couple of important things. The most basic reason is we're describing food availability. The other reason we're concerned about productivity is because this is an important component of the carbon cycle. And as we're going to see as we look at these different biogeochemical cycles and we talk a little bit more about climate change, this is a driver of climate change. When we looked at just the human population up here, the dynamics of the human population, we are in exponential growth. And that exponential growth rate matched our fossil fuel rate, and that also matched the increase in our global temperature. So if we start with the plants, the things that are available in the soil that have been broken down by bacteria and fungi are taken up then by the plants as they're available. Conditions across different ecosystems where decomposition is happening at various rates. We have the availability of nutrients regulated by how much decomposition is occurring, and our decomposers are going to operate at different rates based on what the temperature is and how much water is available. And so those nutrients then are assimilated into the biomass of the plants above ground and below ground. As this is occurring then, we're releasing carbon dioxide, and that carbon dioxide in turn is being taken up by these producers as they're assimilating these nutrients into their plant tissue. We have a lot of nutrient cycling just between the soil, the atmosphere, and our plants already. So you can really see the heavy role of the bio part of biogeochemical cycling. Now, again, as the plant tissue is eaten by our primary consumers, then those nutrients that were taken up will move up through the different trophic levels. And when the plant dies, we return the cycle, and the decomposers will liberate those nutrients to other plants. and other fungi and other bacteria. So we're feeding not only plants when we're cycling nutrients between the atmosphere and the soil, but we're also feeding a whole microbiome of microbes that are facilitating the turnover of these nutrients. So when we talk about the microbiome that's associating with the roots of plants, we call this the rhizosphere. The plant actually releases sugars through its roots and feeds different parts of the microbiome. Actually has control to some extent over what it invites to participate in that rhizosphere, just like we do, right? When we consume different foods, we feed our microbiome. So now we've got this soil community, we've got a plant community, and we can see how nutrients are cycling again between the atmosphere and the plants and the soil organisms. We have soil organic matter that is liberated by our decomposing community, and the nutrients there are going to be taken up by plants. Plants are taking in carbon dioxide as well from the atmosphere. They're assimilating the carbon dioxide and the nutrients into plant biomass. So we've got a lot of nutrients taken up by plants after they're liberated by decomposers. And remember, decomposers are also releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So any heterotroph is going to be releasing carbon dioxide, and any autotroph is going to be picking up that carbon dioxide. And then we have the opposite dynamic for oxygen, right? Our plants are going to release oxygen, and our heterotrophs will be taking up the oxygen. So the standing biomass is consumed by our primary consumers. At some point, all of these organisms, even decomposers, will die, adding soil organic matter to the soil, and that's eventually liberated and taken up by plants again. So overarching general cycle of nutrients and energy through any ecosystem. And if we do not have conditions to facilitate decomposition, the nutrients don't go anywhere. This is where the nature of our fossil fuels comes from, right? This is essentially only partially decomposed organic matter. And we find those accumulating in different regions, leading to our fossil fuel storage. And we also talked about this in terms of where do we store carbon, right? So fossil fuels would be one form of storage of carbon. If we didn't access it and burn it, right, that those carbon sources would stay there for a very, very long time. We now have evidence that we have the highest amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere at this time than we've ever had on this planet. So that's why we're so obsessed with what happens to carbon, where it goes, and where the heck can we store this stuff. So if we have a lot of water in the soils, that could drive decomposition. But if we have too much, if we're completely saturated, we're actually going to inhibit decomposition, because remember, we're talking about heterotrophs that are breaking down our organic matter, and they require oxygen. So in soils that are really inundated, we're going to have very low oxygen. And we see this reflected in some of our structures that our plants have adapted in order to live in wetland soils. We also have to think about, and we looked at this a lot when we looked at succession. What is it that's entering the soil as detritus? What organic matter is entering the soil, right? As we get larger plants and more animals, that's going to be much more rich in nutrients and carbon for the soil. If we have just our little lichen and little fungi, that's not a lot of nutrition to add to that soil. But it accumulates, of course, over time. And then we're also, remember, going to be feeding this microbiome of fungi and archaeans and bacteria, but we'll also have small organisms, small animals, worms mostly, that will also be facilitating the breakdown of our organic matter. It's kind of a different perspective than when we look at our primary consumer community that's being fed by plants. Our decomposer community is being fed by the detritus that comes from the plants and the animals there. We have areas then, of course, where decomposition is very, very slow. So we get a lot of buildup of organic matter. This is an area that would have stored carbon then. And so what's happening now is our warming conditions were exacerbating the rate at which carbon is lost to the atmosphere. Then we have the opposite condition in our tropical rainforest. So in our tropical rainforest, the soil is actually very poor. So here we've got the perfect conditions. We've got where it's warm, it's just moist enough, plenty of oxygen available. We have an insane amount of plant life there. And so decomposition is so fast that the nutrients are made available right away to these massive plants growing up out of the soil. These guys grow way, way up high because now everybody's competing for light in these regions. And so these massive plants just suck those nutrients up right away. And so it's very, very poor in terms of organic matter and nutritional content in those tropical rainforest soils. So when we remove the plant life from a tropical rainforest, in deforestation, there's a lot of regions that will clear cut the rainforest in order to accomplish agriculture there. And we can make a lot of judgment calls about those countries, but our own country did that. Right when we settled here, we wiped out tons of forests and replaced them with agricultural land. So we have done the exact same thing. It's a little more extreme here because of the massive amount of productivity that we have in our tropical rainforests. Remember, our tropical rainforests are the most productive ecosystems on the planet. So it's all tied up in that biomass, right? We have this practice called slash and burn. And so slash and burn means you take all of those massive plants down and then you burn them. Now you're adding all of that carbon back to the atmosphere that would have been stored. At both extremes, we have interfered with these carbon storage sites. As we were talking about with our slash and burn agriculture, anytime we take biomass away, we're also removing nutrients. So in that type of management of those forests, we've not only liberated all that carbon, but we've also taken all the nutrients out of the system. So agriculture there is only sustainable for about 5 to 10 years. And then after that, you're left with a desert because there was no organic matter stored in those upper layers of the soil, right? You can grow some plants for a little while. All of that ash that's left, the reason they burn it is because it liberates all the nutrients to the top layers of the soil. But again, that's only enough to sustain agriculture for a few years. Likewise, remember we're talking about range. Well, if an herbivore no longer has the plants to eat there, or something changes in the conditions for the herbivore and it leaves, you're also removing nutrients with that herbivore. That cycling that it would have done, releasing its nutrients, goes somewhere else. Now, this was a positive thing in our grasslands, right? Our herbivores eat, they poop a little bit, they move to the next place, they poop and pee some more. So they're kind of like this roving fertilizer, right? They're not staying in one place. And this was actually a good thing. But they're still within that overall ecosystem, right? If they were lost from that ecosystem, then we're going to lose that piece of nutrient cycling there as well. So again, as we lose organisms, we lose some of the drivers of our biogeochemical cycles. If we're not digging down and burning it, it's just sitting there in the rock, in the very deep levels of the soil. So these are long-term pools. And then as the geology changes, as our plates shift and push up different rocks, they're exposed to weathering. So rock containing long-term pools of carbon is weathered mostly by water, and this slowly liberates, right? Freeze is what I mean by liberate, slowly liberates carbon from that long-term pool. So this isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? This is part of the natural cycle of carbon. And this is the part that we've skipped over and we've accelerated. Part of distributing nutrients around the planet. Some wind moves things, right? It disperses seeds, it can disperse chemicals, right? And those can land in different places and then be carried by streams. We remember have our partners, our nitrogen fixing rhizobium bacteria that can actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere and provide it to plants and to the soil community in general. If we want to understand how these chemicals move around the planet and how they're stored, we have to think about what the reservoirs are, right? How long are these long-term? Are these short-term reservoirs? This means storage sites, sites of origination of our elements. We have to think about how quickly our elements would move and leave reservoirs or be added back to the reservoirs, and what makes that happen. And then how do these interact with each other? How do our different biogeochemical cycles interact with each other? So sunlight is driving the evaporation of water off of the oceans. That evaporation occurs to an extent where it accumulates in clouds. And so the clouds are then blown across the planet by our prevailing winds. It becomes very, very heavy, and the air also cools at the same time, the higher in elevation we get. And so that water falls as precipitation. The evaporation is constantly happening, but the precipitation may be falling in different places in different amounts. As our water is moving around over the continents, we also have water being transpired by plants. Now, once that precipitation falls onto the continents, we now will have the water running across the continents through watershed. The watershed is essentially the pathway that the water is going to follow from land into streams and ultimately into the ocean. We do have groundwater. We have what we call aquifers, and those are long-term storage sites of water. Aquifers will accumulate water that has fallen onto the land and trickled down into groundwater that's in the soil. If the soil is permeable enough, and aquifers then provide a long-term storage. Of course, our reservoir for all water would be the ocean, but that's not really water that's available for most organisms to use as drinking water. That's usually too salty for most plants, as that ion content is so high that you have a hypertonic solution. So where we could actually find storage sites, reservoirs of fresh water would be our aquifers. And then also we have storage sites in our glaciers. So here's the major reservoir again of Earth's water. The reason the ocean is so salty is because as all this water is traveling over land as runoff, it is, remember, it's weathering nutrients, it's weathering ions. We also have ions released from volcanic activity. So there's some ions that will be accumulating as particulate in the atmosphere, and that will also collect in the ocean. So essentially, everything that is weathering on land will eventually make it into the ocean. So that's why we have so many ions there in the ocean. When water evaporates off of the ocean, it leaves the ions behind. And so now it's blown over our continents, over different parts of the ocean as well. And when that water falls, it's lacking those ions. And as it moves through rivers and collects in lakes, so this would be a shorter term, a little bit smaller reservoir in our lakes. Again, we said we can also have water percolate into groundwater and stored in our soil as groundwater. It can percolate into open aquifers, so that would be feeding lakes, that would be feeding into the ocean as well. We also have closed aquifers depending on the bedrock. If we have porous bedrock, we said this would be a long-term reservoir as well. So these are all going to be relatively large and long-term reservoirs. And then we have our smaller short-term reservoirs. The reason I highlighted those things is because some things have been happening to those long-term reservoirs. And we've seen aquifers in the central U.S. being reduced by as much as 50% over the last 70 or so years. And so this long-term aquifer is going to be dictating the height of the water table, right? So that's the upper limit that we could find water that would be available to us as drinking water. And so that is not only on our continent falling, but on every other continent. And this is by and large due to agriculture and food production. That requires an insane amount of water and fossil fuels, but also our own use of water. In the US, I think that our estimate, at least 100 gallons a day
whereas each individual requires only 1 gallon per day.
Okay, so that's a big discrepancy. Certainly, these are all important areas where we really need to figure out water conservation, because we tap into this water table, especially in our driest regions, in order to still support these activities. So if we're going to be able to continue to use water as living organisms on the planet, we're going to have to conserve in all 3 of those areas. And if you remember, this is the map. It just represents one aquifer in our continent that is drastically reducing. So our reds and our darker yellows mean that we're between 35 and over 45 meters of decline. Of course, this isn't all the way up to date. This is already old. So now glaciers obviously are too far away for us to use as a drinking source, but in the mountains, we have snowpack. So those are 2 other storage sites that are reducing in size. We are actually entering a water crisis, especially as our population continues to grow exponentially. Our next element that we'll look at is nitrogen. Nitrogen is, of course, one of the limiting nutrients, and that means that we have to have it in order to live. If we don't have it, it will limit our productivity in plants and our ability to live as animals. As we trace nitrogen, and we've already looked at this once already when we were thinking about bacteria, because bacteria play such a huge role in the nitrogen cycle. Our reservoir, our pool of nitrogen, is the atmosphere. It has to be converted. So this is a very slow pool. We need those rhizobium partners, those bacteria. Once it enters the plants, then remember that plant matter falls to the soil, and decomposers start to break apart our plant organic matter and liberate nitrogen as either ammonium or nitrate. We had different groups of microbes competing for that nitrate and ammonium along with our plants. And so we have a lot of this mobile pool used very quickly. Another way that we can liberate elemental nitrogen is through lightning. And that might not seem substantial where we live, but if you've ever been to the Midwest or the East Coast, they have a lot of lightning storms out there, Rocky Mountains as well. So it is actually pretty frequent occurrence. So here's our schematic. Here's our major reservoir. Again, slow pool. So we do fix a fair amount of our atmospheric nitrogen and turn it into fertilizer, which enters our soil, shifts us towards our nitrate producing or nitrifying bacteria. And so we have a ton of nitrate, excess nitrate in the soil that gets leached. Otherwise, we would have our nitrogen sources being cycled between our terrestrial organisms and our decomposers, right? So back and forth between plants and soil. Here's the role for our nitrogen fixing bacteria and for some liberation of nitrogen as the effect of lightning. So these are all sources that add it to our soil. These 2 would be sources that would maintain the balance between our plants and our decomposers. This throws off the balance and leads to runoff and eutrophication. If we look at the aquatic side, another group of bacteria that fixes nitrogen for us. So our aquatic organisms can take up the nitrogen sources there. They're going to have their own decomposition cycle. So that would be another more rapidly turning over reservoirs of nitrogen. This would be a long-term pool, slow turnover. So the majority of our atmosphere is nitrogen. We're not at risk of drawing down our long-term pools of nitrogen. We are at risk of adding too much nitrogen to our aquatic reservoirs. That's right. We overload this aquatic short-term pool, and then it becomes problematic for our aquatic organisms. One of the implications of throwing off that balance in terrestrial ecosystems is altering the species diversity. So remember, we're not only feeding plants, we're feeding microbiomes, right? That's what was causing a shift here in our aquatic systems. So if we alter that microbiome on the rhizosphere in our decomposing food web, we are changing what we are feeding our plants.
We also have symbiotic partners that make up part of the microbiome of the soil in the form of mycorrhizal fungi. And mycorrhizal fungi exchange resources with the plants, trading the sugars that the plants produce for valuable water, nitrogen, and phosphorus. So when we alter the chemical cycling by adding additional nitrogen or phosphorus in the form of fertilizers, we change the way that bacteria cycle and recycle nutrients because we're shifting their biodiversity, and we're doing the same thing to these mycorrhizal partners. And we have well documented evidence that mycorrhizal partners' identity also determines plant diversity and success.
So if we're adding nitrogen, if we're fertilizing these regions, this is expensive to the plant. So they may have to kick off different mycorrhizal partners. They may be parasitized by their mycorrhizal partners. So regardless, we're going to shift diversity. And so that all influences which plants are successful. So this is what they mean by altering our diversity and even decreasing our species diversity. Once we alter the plant diversity, we ultimately alter our consumers' diversity. So as we look at each of the biogeochemical cycles, we're not only examining how they operate, but we're really starting to build the case for what's happening with our climate change, what's driving this climate change, right? So we've already looked at sources of water and the water cycle where humans are interfering, and now we are seeing evidence of where in nitrogen fixation we are starting to shift what these organisms have evolved to exist in. And that's the concern. So eutrophication, Peru has really been hit hard by some of these climate changes mostly because their economy really is driven by anchovy fisheries. Here, runoff, we have industrial area nearby. Anytime we have that loading of nitrogen and phosphorus in our waters, we cause a bloom. Those toxic plankton are going to release things like domoic acid, which wipes out our top predators because they're vertebrates, and vertebrates are affected by the neurotoxins. So this is a huge anoxic region that could also be suffering from neurotoxin release of a bloom. It's really ugly and really stinky and really messes up your economy because we can't use this for recreation. We can't use these fish for consumption. It's just a stinky wasteland. The carbon cycle is obviously what is been the most drastically altered, which has led to a lot of the things that we're concerned about here. And again, our evidence for this comes from our initial cores. So whatever is in the atmosphere will get absorbed to a certain extent by that ice. And as more ice builds, we've essentially taken a snapshot of time periods from way back in the geological past. We've been able to go back hundreds of thousands of years by going deep enough in that ice. And so as each surface level is exposed to the atmosphere, we get little bubbles of that trapped in the ice. And we've been able to analyze those. And so we do know that the carbon is the highest it's ever been in the history of life on this earth. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, so it's trapping in heat. And so those two things together are our greatest concern in terms of the causes of these increases in temperature and acidity trends that we're seeing around the globe. So when we look at the global carbon cycle, again, we're going to look at how carbon moves between terrestrial ecosystems, the ocean, and the atmosphere. Our ocean is the reservoir for carbon as well as it is for water. We have a short-term and rapidly cycling pool of carbon as we look at the interactions between our producers and our consumers, right? So we have photosynthesis, removing carbon and incorporating it into biomass. And then we have consumption, incorporating that biomass and liberating carbon dioxide again. Autotrophs are releasing the O2, our heterotrophs are releasing the CO2. But autotrophs pick up CO2 and heterotrophs pick up O2, so we should have an equal exchange of these gases. And both of these gases are in very, very low concentrations in our atmosphere. The majority of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen. So this doesn't even make up that much of the atmosphere. And we've got an equal exchange of these things through just the life on the planet. If we actually keep track of the exact amounts of the carbon dioxide gas that is being taken up by photosynthesis and the ocean, we actually take up more carbon dioxide by natural processes. So there's a slight shift in favor of photosynthesis in actually acquiring CO2 from the atmosphere. The long-term real storage place is in our terrestrial organisms, the ocean, and fossil fuels. Remember, fossil fuels should be buried down under the ground. They're only very infrequently released through weathering of rock, or maybe some release of like a volcanic explosion or fires. But what we've done is we've tapped that long-term large reservoir and we're cranking it out. Look at the size of that arrow. Bigger than anything else on the planet is releasing CO2. And so that's what's happening. We've released so much in so short of a period of time that we're really changing things. We've really altered this dynamic under which life has evolved. We're tapping into this inactive, very, very slow pool. We're loading up the atmosphere very quickly with it. When we remove our forests and we replace them with agriculture, and we add loads of carbon dioxide because we've taken away the storage site, maybe we burned some of that biomass. Even if we haven't burned the biomass, when we accomplish agriculture and raising food products, we use a lot of fossil fuels. So think about it. We've got tractors. Tractors have to seed our agricultural plots. They have to go around and feed these large tracts that we're raising animals on. Then we have to round up all the animals, or we have to collect up all of the crops. And again, we're using gas-driven vehicles to do that. And then we ship those products to different places and we refine them. So all of those steps uses gasoline. All of those steps uses oil and petroleum. So we use a lot of fossil fuel through those activities. And so that's why you may hear when people talk about sustainable practices, it's buying food that's raised close to where you live on a smaller scale and eating less meat. So we've seen this data. I think we're pretty comfortable with the idea then that this blanket that's formed from our greenhouse gases, well, if we keep adding to those layers of blankets, we're going to insulate the planet much more, and our heat is going to be trapped to a larger extent, right? We increase the atmosphere's heat trapping potential. The solar radiation that would come in and be reflected is now being trapped more.
As greenhouse gases trap heat towards the earth, a series of positive feedbacks can occur. For example,
the increasing frequency and intensity of forest fires, liberation of carbon dioxide when our permafrost melts and when decomposition is promoted in areas that it didn't used to be. When we lose glacial ice, we're losing habitat through a series of events. Normally, when the summer months come and we start to break up some of that Arctic ice, we will have spaces in the ice. We still have ice coverage, but now we've got spaces so organisms can start to move. And on the underneath of these large expanses of ice fields that cover the ocean, we have green algae, phytoplankton, a certain kind of phytoplankton. Well, this is food for a very important organism in marine food chains. And this little guy is called krill. Krill, or similar amphipods, they're like little tiny shrimp. These guys feed almost everybody. They feed marine birds, fish, but then these ginormous organisms, the whales, will feed on these guys and phytoplankton exclusively. So all of these organisms will migrate to our Arctic regions in the summertime in order to access this food source, and that feeds the rest of the food chain. So when we lose coverage, it's one way we're losing habitat and food sources. Now remember, all of these fish are going to feed things like seals, all right? And so we have less seals maybe as a part of this effect too. We also have less coverage isolating our polar bears. And so these guys are having a really hard time, because what they'll do is they will use the ice as coverage and camouflage so that the seals below can't see them coming, and they'll burst through the ice and they'll capture a seal. And there's even less ice for the seals to hide in as well. Now, when the ocean and terrestrial glaciers melt, they add fresh water to our ocean. And this alters our thermohaline circulation. So thermohaline is made up of salinity, that's the haline, and temperature. So dense water sinks in the north and drives global circulation. So where water sinks, other water is pushed up. And along with that, nutrients from the bottom are also pushed up. And this is all going to depend on what the bottom topography is like of the ocean and where our coastal boundaries are. So a lot of times those nutrients will be pushed up along the coast, and that will feed the food chain there along the coast because we're feeding plankton. Plankton feed zooplankton and on up the food chain. If fresh water is added, it is less dense than the salt water, so it sits. We call this stratification. And when there's stratification, there's no movement of water, no deep currents, which means no movement. When these major circulation patterns are altered, remember, we have atmosphere interacting with the surface of the ocean. So where we have warm waters on top, the warmer it gets, the more it should be evaporating and moving around as precipitation. Well, if we're not moving the water at all and we're heating now in different regions, we're going to alter precipitation patterns as well. We've seen this in El Nino events, seen that the way that the circulation of the air and the water changes results in rain patterns that are different from non-El Nino years. We're also losing the ability to reflect the sunlight, and so we're exacerbating the amount of heat that's absorbed on the planet, again, when we lose these ice caps, altering ocean currents and cloud cover. And then finally, with just terrestrial glaciers, they're going to add more water to the ocean in general. So again, we have habitat loss. Now, what could happen is if our precipitation patterns support it, we could just grow more plants, right? Because plants love CO2. They're taking up the majority of the CO2. The problem is our precipitation is not keeping pace with the growth of plants. So when we do have a big burst in productivity, usually we have years following that we have drought. And so then that biomass burns, becomes fuel for fires. Not only are we losing habitat, but we're altering the timing at which things are happening for organisms. So if we have warmer weather, that might alter how plants are flowering. In fact, we have evidence that flowers are opening at different times, which means pollination is going to happen at different times, which means the formation of fruits and seeds will happen at different times, or even the turnover of nutrients in the ocean. Those are happening at different times and in different places to less extent. And if organisms have already evolved to migrate in a certain pattern or reproduce at a certain time, these seasonal events aren't going to line up with the food sources. This is a good summary. We're altering how productivity is happening. We are changing the environment. We're changing the rate of photosynthesis and where rain is falling. And so we're going to see shifts essentially in where the food sources are and where we have fuel for forest fires. We're seeing an overall drop in productivity in our marine organisms, and this is in part due to stratification and the thermohaline halting. This is also due to acidification and warming of our ocean waters, right? Are those little critters, those little plankton are very, very sensitive to these changes. These are little single-celled organisms. And so when things are changing, such as pH and temperature, then our photosynthetic rate of those little organisms are going to change. Loss of storage of carbon is going to be positive feedback. We're going to continue to exacerbate change in precipitation, the rate at which our oceans are acidifying, and those will all impact our food web dynamics. This is why we get concerned, right? This is why scientists are trying to really push awareness of what's happening on our planet.
So let's check back in and see how we did answering our initial questions posed for this lecture. We have reviewed many sources of evidence from peer-reviewed data sets that have been published in peer-reviewed journals. This data shows the anthropogenic causes, such as release of fossil fuel emissions that have led to a general warming trend in the temperature of our planet, which has led to a loss of habitat, coupled with human development and agricultural practices, use of fertilizers, and the rate at which we're using water have all contributed to changes in overall climate. We've seen why these trends are concerning, from the loss of glacier ice to the loss of habitat and an overall alteration of our biogeochemical cycling. Make sure that you can explain how each of these biogeochemical cycles should work and how they have been affected by these anthropogenic activities.